It's a new academic year, and we've been doing this series now. It's our 5th academic year doing these monthly contemporary China events. The Paulson Institute, in partnership with the Harris School, which Bill is the public policy school here, kind of like the Kennedy School at Harvard, where Bill is based. Since it's a new academic year, and I see a lot of new faces, some old faces, I think what I'll do is I'll just say something quickly about the Institute and the series, and then I'll say something about Bill. So the Institute is a contemporary China-focused institute on campus. We work largely on macroeconomics and also on environmental issues in China. We call ourselves a think and do tank. Most of the think side is macroeconomics, and the do side is mainly environmental programming in China. We used to be right here on Woodlawn, so I used to get up here every month and say, come knock on our door, come visit us, come talk to us about China, but we've just moved our office downtown. So like the Gleacher Center and some of the other University of Chicago associated centers and institutes that are downtown, we're a little harder to get to now. We're down on the Mag Mile on Michigan Avenue. However, we're still both individually and collectively around campus, and we decided even though we'd moved, we'd keep doing this series. It's a good way to talk to people on campus about China and keep people focused on what's going on, which has never been more important in my view than it is now, as things start to unravel a little bit between the US and China. And in some areas, I would argue, in China too. So this is a monthly series. We do all kinds of topics. We do economics, we do politics, we do society, we do culture. We have lots of interesting speakers lined up for this year. We do it monthly. We're going to do one on media and the propaganda system in China. We've got one on China and Africa lined up. We have one on US-China relations. We have one on the history of economic reform in China and what we can learn from that. And we have some others too. But Bill Overholt, an old colleague and friend, is going to kick us off. And he's got a new book, China's Crisis of Success, which I think you're going to have some copies of. So if anybody wants to buy a copy afterwards, you can do that, and Bill will sign it for you. Bill's been around a long time with China and in different walks of life, which is a good thing. He's been around academic institutions, but he's also been in banking. He's run a global research institute and now is hanging your hat mainly at Harvard and writing, but is still involved with lots of different interest groups and constituencies on China, from war colleges to banking and financial services institutions and others. I've always liked Bill's writing because you're a bit of a contrarian and not firmly ensconced in the conventional wisdom, of which there's a lot these days. When I was a couple of years into my Ph.D. program in the early 1990s, your book, The Rise of China, came out. One of the first books around that said China was going to rival the US as a kind of peer competitor, superpower, really called the shot on a lot of aspects of China's rise. And Bill has this new book out called China's Crisis of Success, which I like because, as I said, at a time when there's a lot of conventional wisdom going around, you'll see if you read the book, and hopefully as we hear Bill talk, that he has a much more diverse and complex view, I think, on China, where people tend to see relentless success. Bill sees a lot of failure as well and reactions to it, where people see a kind of totalitarian unity. Bill sees a lot more pluralism, and where some people see China's policies, particularly toward the outside world, but especially internally, being driven by a sense of triumphal success. The way I've read your work is that you see a lot more complexity to that too. And in fact, some of it is driven by what we might call a reaction to failures of the system, not just to the successes, many of which are obvious for everybody to see. So Bill's going to kick us off for the year. And as I said, we do this every month. And even though we're not on campus anymore, keep in touch with us. We've got our whole team is back there. Damien Ma, Hoza Song, Denny McMahon, all the people that work with us. The think tank side of our work, by the way, we've rebranded a little bit. It's called Macro Polo now. So it's a constituent part of the Paulson Institute, but if you want to look at some of the work we're doing. It's branded as macropolo.org of the Paulson Institute, so you can check it out. It's a slightly different web platform. Okay, so Bill, we're very casual. We'll have you come up and talk for, I don't know, half hour, 40 minutes, and then do your own Q&A. And you'll find this is always a very lively group with lots of questions, and lots of people know a lot about China. In any case, welcome everybody. We're looking forward to the year, and please join me in welcoming Bill Overholt to Chicago. Welcome.
Thanks, Evan. Sit down. Thank you all for coming out to hear about China on Columbus Day. It's a particular pleasure to talk at this institute. If we had Hank Paulson, Treasury, and Evan at State, we wouldn't be in the mess with China that we're in today. So I'm very happy to be here. I always seem to have a viewpoint on China that's different from the conventional wisdom, as Evan mentioned. There are reasons for that. One is that, particularly now, China has the best PR in the world, and the people in Washington and in the media see this perfectly coiffed, totally in control leader with all these titles and all the Stepford bureaucrats sitting behind, all with the black suit and the white tie and the white shirt and the red tie. And it creates an image. I also often differ with many of the China scholars, and the difference is that I try to put things in a comparative perspective. If you've only ever seen the color black, you may not really understand anything about the color black. And it's that way with studying China. If you only study China, you miss an awful lot. So I'm going to try to put things in a comparative perspective. And the comparative perspective that I use is China's one of these Asian miracle economies. It's South Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, to some extent Japan. They all began as Leninist-type polities with extremely centralized socialist-style economies, important variations, but this worked. It worked in a particularly spectacular way. And the World Bank and the world's economists have studied these economies to death. And we know what leads to their success. But there are only about 8 countries in the world that have followed the recipe for success. Now, why is that? Isn't running a developing country all about development? It turns out to be very difficult to implement all these lessons. The politics is incredibly difficult. So it works only in extremely simplified situations. These start out, and Japan's an exception because it was reconstructing an economy. It wasn't developing from scratch. You've got owners and peasants and road builders and cheap socks manufacturers, and even a government can figure out how to manage an economy like that. And the politics is simplified. If you notice, these countries are all countries that started out extremely scared. This is Japan after World War II, South Korea after the Korean War, Taiwan after the Chinese Civil War, Singapore after very traumatic separation from Malaya, and China after a really bad hair century. And this simplifies the politics because the leaders know that they have to take really big, risky decisions or the place is going to fall apart. So they do things that normal politicians would never try. And the people accept things that they would never normally accept because they're scared. They're scared that their families are not going to have food. They're scared of civil war. They're scared that their children will die before they're 5 years old. So they take a level of stress that is not normal. What do I mean by that? Well, at the beginning of reform, the peasants in Anhui started taking back the land from the communes. This went 100% against what the Communist Party stood for at the time, but it endangered the most important lever of power the Communist Party had, which was detailed control over the individual life of every peasant. But Deng Xiaoping looked at this and he said, seems to be making the country more prosperous, and the farmers seem to really like it. So we'll not only allow them to do it, we'll spread it through the rest of the country. And looking back, especially through the eyes of economists, this seems like the most obvious thing in the world to do. But if you're looking forward from Deng Xiaoping's point of view, this is giving up the most important lever of power the party had. Later, the same thing happened in the cities. And the Zhurongji and Jiang Zemin had to give up a lot of control over industry and the lives of people in industry. And again, they took the risk of giving up these terribly important levers in return for economic successes that would give the party the voluntary support of huge numbers of people. And it worked. But they didn't know at the time that it would work. When I talk about the stresses that the people accept, Zhurongji laid off 45 million people from manufacturing jobs in 10 years. Now, he found them jobs in the service economy for the most part. But think how this country reacted to losing 3 million industrial jobs in 10 years. We're still traumatized by it. Our politics today, to some extent, follow from that. And he wanted to cut the government in half. And at the top levels, he came pretty close. Can you imagine Ronald Reagan saying he's going to cut the US government in half? Unthinkable. China's got a much bigger government to cut in half. Not disproportionate to the population, but a bigger role in society. The people accepted this because they were afraid. One of the things that happens when an economy succeeds, the simplicity goes away, the fear goes away, you get into a different situation. When reform started, I could see that Deng Xiaoping was just copying things that had worked, policies that had worked in these other countries. And so I said, I wrote this book, The Rise of China, which at the time was very contrary to the conventional wisdom. The leading review in London said, this guy's bank must have paid him a lot of money to write such nonsense. But for me, it was you know, when Park Chung-hee was doing these things in South Korea and Zhang Jingguo was doing them in Taiwan, our intellectual and political leaders hated it. They said, this is awful, it will never work. But it did work. And for me, the only issue was, could you scale it up to the size of China? And that question has been answered. By the middle of Hu Jintao's era, he was 2003 to 2013, I felt they were on a different track and started writing different things, and this book is the culmination. And it leaves me with a very different image, an image of leaders who are fighting the emergence of this complex economy and complex polity, don't know quite how to manage it, feel terribly vulnerable. And this is very different from this behemoth that people in Washington perceive, this Putin-like figure who is totally in control, running an economy that has this totally controlled structure that's going to grow fast for the indefinite period, and it's a behemoth that is going to roll over us poor, helpless Americans if we don't react very strongly. That is not my image. Now, unlike 25 years ago when I wrote The Rise of China, I can't tell you what's going to happen. I don't have a strong prediction, except that change is coming. What I can do is give you a way of thinking about where China is in its evolution and a set of indicators that you can watch and make your own conclusions. So, my characterization of China is that it's having a crisis of success. What's a crisis of success? Well, suppose you're a Silicon Valley entrepreneur and you invent a really cool widget and it just takes off and you're making a lot of money, but you're running this company essentially as an entourage. And you get to the point where you need more money and you need more structure. You've got to list on the stock exchange. All of a sudden you need real professional accounting and real professional human resources and a public rule book and a board of directors. You have to transform the business. And if you succeed, it keeps on going. And if you don't, you get into this Elon Musk moment where maybe it'll work and maybe it won't, and it could plateau or it could crash. All these miracle economies hit this point. They hit it quite dramatically because of the degree of their success. You get a big success and a big crisis. The crisis always manifests itself the same way. The big companies start having problems, and in China today, the big state enterprises can't earn back their cost of capital. And the economy as a whole gets into a degree of financial squeeze. China today has a high ratio of debt to its economy. South Korea in 1979 had to borrow huge amounts of money. It had a 40% inflation rate. And in addition to the economic and financial problems, politics changes character. You have more demonstrations. You have really powerful interest groups and huge numbers of them. And so the leader starts feeling that things are coming unstuck. And they have to react to that. So, how has China responded to this? Well, they see the problems of economic complexity very, very clearly. And I would argue that their economic planning on paper has been the most sophisticated in world history. Long before Xi Jinping was even a clear choice for next leader, the National Development Reform Commission worked with the World Bank and published a book called China 2030, which said we need all kinds of market reforms and governance reforms. And then after Xi Jinping came in, what was called the Third Plenum published a plan that started with the market allocation of resources and drew about 300 specific reform conclusions from that axiom of the market allocation of resources. Now, if you turn a lot of the decision-making over to the market, you overcome the problem of complexity. You don't have to make all the decisions out of a few little offices in Beijing. And in economic theory, they should be more efficient. But they've had problems implementing these policies. The politics has gotten in the way. And the response to political complexity has been a very tough crackdown. Try to get control. And there's a lot of tension between the economic response and the political response to very similar problems. Now, if you go back to the early Asian miracle economies, in Taiwan, the leader, Zhang Jingguo, was a really tough, nasty character. He was a member of the Soviet Communist Party. He was Taiwan's toughest security chief. In many ways, he was much more unpleasant toward dissidents than the guys on the mainland. On the mainland, they put you in jail and let you rot. Zhang Jingguo would take you out to Green Island and shoot you. But he was in touch with his society. And so he allowed a very gradual evolution of a market economy and a market-like political system. So the transition was relatively smooth. This starts with the Kaohsiung incident in 1979 and evolves through the 80s. In South Korea, Park Chung-hee didn't get it. He was going to be King Canute pushing back the tide. And they had a bunch of big student demonstrations scheduled for October of 1979. The Korean CIA told him, things are getting complicated. You better make some concessions and do some deals, or it's going to be chaotic. Park's bodyguards said, station sharpshooters on top of major buildings and shoot the student leaders. And Park went with the bodyguards. So the head of the Korean CIA, and the second most powerful man in Korea, a good friend of Park Chung-hee, invited him out to dinner with two pretty girls and shot him in the head because he thought otherwise Korea would be completely chaotic. So Korea had a little more difficult transition than Taiwan did. In many ways, China has chosen a super sophisticated version of Taiwan's economic evolution, but an analog of Park Chung-hee's political approach. By that, I don't mean that Xi Jinping is going to get assassinated. I think that's very unlikely. But having characterized the situation, let me go back and look how China got into this crisis of success. It starts with Zhu Rongji and Jiang Zemin and these extraordinary market reforms in the period leading up to through 2002. They laid off 45 million people. They tried to cut the government in half. And this just stressed out the population. Again, compare that with what happened with 3 million people in this country. By the last 18 months of Zhu Rongji's decade, people were just expressing hatred of Zhu Rongji. He's back to being a hero today, which is right. But they just couldn't take it anymore. So they got a new leadership under Hu Jintao, where the promise was harmonious society. Now, harmonious society had all sorts of layers of philosophical meaning, but the operational meaning was no more Zhu Rongji market reforms. And so market reform pretty much came to a halt. There was also a problem on the political side. You had 9 leaders in the Politburo Standing Committee, a lot of disagreements, and they worked by majority vote. We have an institution that works that way. It's called the US Supreme Court. Their decisions were very judicious, but not very fast or decisive. And Hu Jintao himself had, although early in his life he'd been known as a very lively, skirt-chasing kind of guy, had very severe diabetes, and so he was rather sluggish. And this rather sluggish government faced a new phenomenon, rise of very powerful interest groups. Under Jiang Zemin, they spent their time centralizing control, getting control of the national money supply, getting to a position where they could move military leaders from one district to another, getting to where they could easily fire a governor of a province. Under Hu Jintao, they seemed to be losing this. The ministries weren't necessarily listening to the prime minister. The local governments weren't necessarily listening to the central government. The military was doing all kinds of things that weren't on the basis of orders from on high. You had these really powerful interest groups. And we think the National Rifle Association is a powerful interest group. Well, let me tell you about a really powerful interest group, the petroleum faction in China. They had control of the flow of energy for China. And there was a market price and there was an official price. And they were pocketing the arbitrage between them, so making tens of billions. And the head of it, Zhou Yongkang, was one of the 9 people running the country, and he was China's security chief. Now there's a powerful interest group. Chinese interest groups are the size of European countries, and the power of European countries. They're a lot more unified often than European countries. So here's an economic and political dilemma that the leaders are facing 8 years ago. What do? Well, the economic theory is market allocation of resources. The political theory is we got to centralize things and get everything under control. So you go from 9 guys running the country to 7. It's all guys. And the 7 exclude the political extremes. Bo Xilai, who liked a lot of reactionary Maoist slogans, and Wang Yang and Li Yuanzhao, who were called extreme reformers, more democratically minded. And I said the new guy will get immediate control of the military, whereas Hu Jintao had to wait for 2 years. And they created a National Security Council for the first time, and a number of what they call small leading groups in charge of military reform and economic reform and Taiwan policy. And they put the new guy in charge of all these things. So you go from from sluggish, decentralized to extraordinarily centralized. And interestingly, they chose Xi Jinping, who had a relatively narrow domestic political base, and that's important. Now, how does this work out? Well, when you try to do the market reforms, you find they step on the toes of all the important groups in Chinese society. You let the market allocate resources, party groups lose power. Government groups lose power. The state enterprises lose their advantages. Because those state enterprises are most of the customers of the banks get unhappy. And in many ways, the most unhappy are the local governments. Let me tell you about local government we studied when I was running a think tank in Hong Kong. Foshan, fabulously successful city, per capita income of $15,000 when we were studying it, way ahead of the rest of China. And their debt service, their interest payments plus their principal payments, is 110% of their tax revenues. They solved that by taking land from the peasants, putting in a little infrastructure, and selling it back at 10 times the original price. That worked pretty well for a long time. What does reform mean? Reform means the interest rates are freed and go up, and so that 110% becomes a bigger number. And then you're not supposed to take so much land from the peasants, so your revenues go down. Another thing it means, in the past, they didn't have to provide social services to the rural migrants, who are 50% of their population. Under reform, they're supposed to end up providing education and medical care and unemployment insurance and pensions. So basically, their social costs double. Now, if you're the mayor or the local party secretary, you say, my God, they're trying to kill us. And you push back. So the pushback is very strong. The military is also getting reformed. Many of the leading generals were put in jail, and their staff was reduced by 300,000. It's very risky for a government to take on every powerful interest group in society at the same time. I joined the banking world because of some predictions I'd made. For instance, that when I saw the Shah of Iran having alienated every important interest group, I started saying he's going to be a goner. And I saw this happening in Poland in 1980. It was my first country risk review for a bank that I did. There's no more risky strategy for any government than taking on every powerful interest group in society at the same time. Nobody is taking the kinds of risks that Xi Jinping is taking. So, how do you work on this? Well, the first term is for consolidating power. It takes 5 years. Get ready. And the second term, just started, is supposed to implement these reforms. And I got thinking there are an awful lot of people who are going to be unhappy about these reforms. So we better allow a third term just in case, because there are going to be people who want to roll back all the policies. And they may even come after the folks who implemented these unpleasant policies. So that's been the thinking. Now, implementing the policies turned out to be very, very difficult. The powerful tool for rolling the interest groups is the anti-corruption campaign. And guess Zhou Yongkang of the petroleum faction that I mentioned earlier. But the anti-corruption campaign creates another problem. It scares everybody. If I'm implementing a reform and I'm stepping on your toes, what are you going to do? You're going to say I'm corrupt. And I probably am. So I feel very vulnerable. So instead of pushing really hard on reform, I'm going to try to hide under the table. I want to be the kid sitting in the back row that the professor won't call on. And so reforms have tended not to happen very much. And facing this situation, every time Xi Jinping is faced with a choice between having his cake and eating it, he says, I'm going to have my cake and eat it too. He doesn't make the big decisions. He says we're going to have market allocation of resources, but the manufacturing program for 2025 and innovation are going to be achieved by providing huge subsidies, $1.7 trillion over a period of years, to state enterprises. Is that market allocation of resources? I'm not going to talk about all these, but these choices are the indicators you can watch to see how China is going. I'm going to tell you, I can't predict the outcome, except I can predict that things aren't going to remain the same. But you can watch these things. I go through the full list in the book. It says we're going to marketize the state enterprises, but we're going to increase the role of the party committee inside each enterprise. And not just in the state enterprises, but in all private enterprises. And these party committees are going to have veto power or control over the business strategies of the companies. Xi Jinping gives wonderful speeches about the importance of the rule of law. But he says we've got to strengthen the party commission that actually oversees the verdicts. There are some problems here. This tight control is supposed to create both the reality and the perception of national stability. And if you're an American media person or a politician in Washington, boy, it looks like he's really got things under control. If you talk to Chinese people, they see this as an unstable, risky situation. It's been years since I met a middle-class or upper-class family that wasn't trying to get its money and its kids out of China. Now, whose view do you want to take? The view of the commentator from Washington or New York or the Chinese people? So he's in a very complicated position on policy. So the conventional wisdom is that this is the most powerful leader since Mao Zedong. And the evidence, he's defeated all his adversaries very decisively. And he's got all these titles. And he's been very popular on corruption and on environment. Corruption is kind of fading because people are starting to feel this is a little bit too factional. But on the environment, he's still very, very popular, and he's doing good things. But these things are different from the ability to implement difficult policies. His indecisiveness doesn't look to me so much like Mao Zedong or Deng Xiaoping. It looks more like Theresa May in the United Kingdom. Is he the new Putin? It's almost the opposite. Yes, they're both authoritarian. But she is a creature of the Communist Party, and he remains a creature of the Communist Party. Putin's party is a creature of Putin. It exists to serve Putin. The Russian economy exists to serve Putin. Xi Jinping is a guy who's been given a job to do. So we have a situation where a leadership that feels very vulnerable and a leader who feels very vulnerable are reacting as much as possible against that. And you can buy the image or not, but I see the essence of the situation as vulnerability. Part of the vulnerability is that this problem of political complexity has always proved to be relentless. And again, you read every American policy magazine, Foreign Affairs, Foreign Policy, they say, oh, we got it wrong. These pressures don't have the effect we thought they would. Well, we don't know what the effect is. Things take time in China, but they're having a very powerful effect. What we're seeing is a very strong reaction against these pressures. And there are all sorts of groups who are not doing overt things at this point, but who are very unhappy. And the lesson of history is that this unhappiness has consequences. Let me just take this one group that's very important: business executives, entrepreneurs. These people throw their lives into building a business. And the party secretary calls up and he says, I got a new project downtown, and I need you to contribute $1 million to it. And the $1 million needs to be in my bank account by next week, or you're shut down. And the entrepreneur has no choice. Deposit the $1 million right now. I talked to a lot of these people, and they're very unhappy about this. And they're unhappy that their friends are just disappearing all the time. Nobody knows who disappeared them. Was it local thugs? Was it the local Discipline Inspection Commission? Was it the Central Discipline Inspection Commission? And you can't ask, because then you may disappear. Under the current economic situation, where the government is trying to get debt under control, the local leaders still have the same responsibilities for creating growth and educating kids and building roads, but their ability to get money is less and less and less. The banks are putting the squeeze on them. What do? They take more and more from the local businesses. Now, if you read studies of history, Barrington Moore's Lord and Peasant in the Making of the Modern World, the relationship between the government and its bourgeois entrepreneurial class is very, very consequential. It takes time for those consequences to become apparent, but they do become apparent eventually. So we shouldn't assume that because China's got an authoritarian system that is functioning right now, that these pressures are not going to have some kind of consequence. Right now, China's in a spiral where the more people organize and complain, the more the government feels threatened, and the bar on what's threatening keeps getting lowered. So now almost any religious group is seen as threatening. 5 women getting together to complain about being groped in public is seen as threatening. And it's kind of a slow spiral. It's difficult to know, again, exactly where that ends, but it probably ends somewhere different from where we are today. It doesn't mean that Western-style democracy is inevitable. It definitely is not. And our policies of having a kind of ideological war against China make it much less likely, because then what our policies do is mean that if China goes to our kinds of elections and so on, that's defeat at the hands of a foreign enemy. And no Chinese leader can accept defeat at the hands of a foreign enemy. At the same time, China's not head for some kind of grand collapse. They have built a very solid system, as Japan did, as South Korea did, as Taiwan and Singapore did. And here I part company almost completely with the majority of American social scientists. And I'll just pick on a few of these. The great development economists of our era, Acemoglu and Robinson at Harvard and MIT, they have shown very convincingly that if you want to sustain economic growth over a long period of time, you have to have an inclusive society. Not a society where a few people on top are grabbing everything. And they assume that political inclusiveness and economic inclusiveness are the same. Well, let me tell you how to, and they make a lot of negative comments about China. It's a non-inclusive society. Well, let me tell you how to build an economically and socially inclusive society in one of these poor countries. First, you take the society's major asset, which is land, and you redistribute the land and land reform, so everybody gets something. And then you educate everybody. All these countries did it, unlike, say, India, where 1/3 of the people are illiterate and half of the women are illiterate. And then you give everybody a job, mostly in the modern economy. By building the right kind of infrastructure and having the right kind of rules, you attract labor-intensive manufacturing. Everybody becomes gradually a worker in textiles and computer assembly. Again, this doesn't happen in a place like India or the Philippines because they're incapable of building the infrastructure and enforcing the rules in a way that is attractive to locate those textile companies and computer companies there. And then, who are the major beneficiaries of all these jobs? Women. You go to a textile company or a computer assembly company, and you have 11 Taiwanese guys and 8,000 Chinese women. And it's still very unfair that it's 11 Taiwanese guys, but most of the employees are women. In traditional society, it was all agriculture, and the only thing that counted was muscle power, and the men had somewhat bigger muscles, so it was very patriarchal. These women go 500, 1,000, 1,500 miles to get these jobs. First year, they have a rough time. Second year on, there's a whole literature on this. You start feeling, the only thing that's going to make me succeed is me, and I'm going to succeed, and it's the women who end up exposed to modern society. And it's the women who end up with a little nest egg that can be the down payment on a home. And this shifts the whole balance of society. There are feminists who are writing about the remaining problems of women in Chinese society, which are very severe. But if you compare with India, where these things don't happen, the difference is dramatic. And on all the scales of the World Bank and the United Nations, Chinese women come out very high. I'll give you one indicator of how things have changed. The woman used to have to bring a dowry in order to get married. Now the man has to prove that he has an apartment. She won't date you unless you have an apartment. Very fundamental. And then you give everybody a home. Guess which country in the world has the highest rate of home ownership? China, 85%. The US varies between 62 and 64%. And then you have a great property price inflation. Again, Japan has experienced this, Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, and China's probably just peaking out. These pieces of property that everybody has become very valuable. But everybody ends up with a stake in society. That's an inclusive society. On the other hand, you hold an election in a country of landlords and peasants. The landlords get together, they get elected, and they screw the peasants. India, you have great Indian institutes of technology, but half the population doesn't get educated. You have world-class hospitals, and the same is true in the Philippines and Thailand. The peasants don't have any money to contribute to politicians. They don't know how to organize. They get left out. The world-class hospitals are for the elite. Your kid has about 5 or 6 times the chance of dying before he's 1 year old in India than in China. And the mother has a much higher chance, a lot higher chance of dying. So this is an inclusive society. They're fixing their environment. They're digging out a very deep hole. But unlike India, they're dealing with it. And so on the other major issues. So as in Korea and Taiwan and Singapore, the basic system is the basic institutions are very solid. There are going to be a lot of issues at the top, a lot of issues of economic and political management, but they build a very solid system. How might this all work out? Well, the pro-Xi Jinping group says he's going to consolidate power and then implement economic reforms, and somebody else will do political reform. One thing nobody says, by the way, is that things are going to remain the same. China's great strength is that they see themselves as a developing place, economically and politically. This contrasted with the old Soviet Union, where Brezhnev and Andropov and so on thought we've created the ultimate system, it's going to take over the world, it's going to stay the same. Another possibility is they'll do successful economic reform and then have a political crisis because they won't deal with the politics. The worst outcome is if they fail at economic reform. Failure would mean the interest groups taking over the way they took over in Japan. Japan had this great takeoff, and then 5 interest groups essentially took ownership of the Japanese political system in the late 70s, and growth went. It wasn't the 1990 stock market and property market collapse that left Japan relatively stagnant. This all happened in the late 1970s and continued from then because they turned inward and these interest groups took over and protected themselves against domestic and foreign competition. China then would stagnate maybe around $15,000 per capita. In Japan, they stagnate around 45,000. It's pretty comfortable at $45,000 per capita. 15,000 is a third of Japanese incomes, and the Chinese people are never going to accept that. So if they succeed at economic reform, they've got to deal with the politics. If they fail at economic reform, they've got to deal with the politics. So I can't tell you exactly what the outcome is going to be, but I can tell you it's going to be different 10 years from now than it is today.
You mentioned, you just reviewed this whole progress of Chinese political system. You mentioned Zhu Rongji, and I have an anecdote here. In 2000, I remember in a People's Congress press conference, Zhu said, some reporter asking him a question, so now we have democratic election in village level. When will we have in provincial or even national level? And Zhu Rongji's word literally was as soon as possible, I hope, which is running in direct conflict with what's happening this year in the same venue, in People's Congress. So my question is, it looks like some people portray it as an epic, masterful con, long game. It's a big con, carried out by different generations of Chinese leaders, even though they sometimes in bloody power struggle, but they still manage to work together and secretly for this long game, even though they, occasionally literally want to kill each other. So my question is, what do you think drives this kind of policy shift? Is that really a crafty, long game strategy, or in so-called 100 marathon, or is it, the Xi or the later generation leaders are actually refuting the plan laid out by the former generation leaders? Or it's more nuanced than both of these views. It's like different generations are working basically independently on their own agenda, but they converge to a seemingly coherent policy, which seems works well until pretty recently for China. So what kind of thing do you think are driving this shift and direction? Thank you.
Great question. One of the things you notice when you step back from the details is that each generation of leaders responds to the weakness of the last generation. Deng Xiaoping obviously responded to Mao's problems. Hu Jintao's harmonious society was a response to the excessive stress of Zhu Rongji's and Jiang Zemin's reforms. The current centralized system is a response to the inadequacies of Hu Jintao's political control and reform, slow reforms. And so they've been in touch with their society. At the same time, as in this country, where we've always had strongly contending views, and so far it's sort of worked out. You have this incredible contention that under Mao it got out of control. Deng Xiaoping achieved a kind of balance. Deng didn't try to grab all sorts of titles. He governed for a while as honorary chairman of the Chinese Bridge Players Society. He allowed a certain degree of open opposition. Chen Yun opposed a lot of his urban reforms. There was a propagandist named Little Deng who was very noisily in opposition, but there was a kind of balance. I think Jiang Zemin will go down as more and more of a genius. He kept Li Peng and Zhu Rongji in the same government and not killing each other. Now the leaders are trying to figure out how to keep things on track in that sense. At every August, the real leaders, the ones who don't have to have titles, get together and talk about what needs to be done, including they choose new leaders. And this year they got together and kind of central theme was Xi Jinping is overdoing it. How do we get things back under control? China's weakness is that there's no institutionalization of a system that keeps things in balance over time, despite all the contention. Deng Xiaoping was able to create, to designate future leaders and to create certain norms. But some of those norms are getting destroyed now. And I think a lot of people in China have some of the same concerns that we Americans have, many of us Americans have about Trump. So they've done pretty well from 1978 until now, but there are no absolute guarantees. I think they have two advantages. One, they evolve very capable leaders who really care about the country as a whole. And I'll divert into a little anecdote. When they published China 2030, the Chinese guy who was in charge of that, excuse me, had the office across the hall from me at Harvard. And I said, great plan, but you've got a very diverse group of potential leaders. What makes you think they'll implement your plan? And he said, well, Mr. Overholt, yes, our leaders are very diverse, but we have an advantage over you. Our senior leaders are all numerate. They could see what was happening in the economy. They all knew what the problems were. But there are no guarantees.
I have a question. So China has been changing its demographic policies recent years. And I wonder, would you change or would you comment on any of your analysis results in the perspective of demographic situations in China?
Yeah. So their demographic squeeze is going to become as serious as Japan's. And in Japan, it had very drastic consequences. If you just run the numbers, it is theoretically possible that through a combination of education, urbanization, and increased competition, that you could completely overcome the demographic deficit. Those policies are not being pursued to a degree now that would overcome it. And one of the consequences is you get a huge number of retired people and a lot of people who have to change jobs. And the welfare costs of dealing with all that just go through the roof. And they were investing at a remarkably accelerated rate to deal with that. Under Xi Jinping, they're putting more money into things like the military, and the rate of investment is looking less adequate to deal with those problems. So I think they are. I think they are going to suffer some of the difficult consequences of the demographic deficit. The change to the multi-child family from one-child policy is interesting, because the reality is that almost all of what we see as the consequences of the one-child policy are actually simply consequences of giving women more than an 8th grade education. Everywhere in the world, when women have more than an 8th grade education, the number of babies they want decreases drastically. And so if you look at comparable demographics in India, meaning groups getting an 8th grade education, the patterns are about the same. The one-child policy had very serious human rights consequences, but the demographic consequences were probably pretty marginal. And from that, you won't be surprised that changing to a multi-child policy isn't having anything like the consequences they had hoped. Women don't seem to be having a lot more children. And in any case, even if they did, it would be a full generation before that would make any difference to the economy.
You know, the word or phrase reform has become a controversial issue in China itself. Part of the reason is everyone, whatever they do, say that they are carrying out or pursuing some form of reform. And in fact, a lot of the dissatisfaction today is about how certain policies are carried out in the name of reform, but in fact they are retrogressive rather than progressive. So you list, particularly in thinking about the potential outcomes, the importance of economic reform. Can you elaborate a little bit on the reform as you see that's needed for China?
Yeah, the thing that too many Americans focus too much attention on is state enterprise reform. And they should be going to a more competitive basis. They're not. They're being consolidated into national champions. They should have to compete equally for financing. They're not. They're getting a higher share of total financing. They should face more private and foreign competition. They're effectively eating a lot of their private domestic competition, and the foreigners are getting squeezed. So that's really not happening. Some kinds of reform have happened. Interest rates are largely market interest rates today. The foreign exchange rate is largely a market rate today. It's managed around the edges, but it's pretty close to a market exchange rate. They had intended to make the Chinese currency an important global currency like the dollar, and in support of that, they had a whole program of reducing capital controls and allowing money to flow in and out freely. Because you can't be a global currency unless people have guaranteed access to the domestic markets. Because people are scared and trying to get their money out of China, they've had to reimpose a lot of capital controls. So the whole renminbi internationalization has actually gone backwards. I I published a book about that a couple of years ago, and I italicized one sentence in the book, which was just the downside of all the risks to renminbi internationalization are on the downside. And I now thank God for that sentence, because it's gone more to the downside than I would have expected. They're trying to get private companies fair access to financing. That's not happening. The credit to the private sector is declining. Private sector investment, which is where most of China's growth comes from and almost all new jobs come from, dropped from 18% growth rate to 2%, and it's now back to about 6%. 6% is less than the growth of the overall economy. So there are many, many of these areas. Where China's had the most success is moving industry up market. They need to get out of making cheap socks and into making higher value added stuff. And they've allowed the market to work there. They've accelerated the effects of the market. I've done a fantastic job there. So it's a very mixed bag.
A while ago, you talked about how China needs institutions to maintain balance. That reminds me, Winston Churchill, in his biography of his ancestor Marlborough, talks about politicians that he called trimmers, who were able to tack from one way to another to achieve some great public good. And so in that view, it was a kind of active politics that certain kinds of leaders could bring about to balance. But it strikes me that Xi Jinping is not that kind of leader, that in fact his moves toward reform are really pseudo-reforms, the anti-corruption campaign being a big example, that the real objective remains keeping the monopoly of power of the Communist Party. But is it possible that there could be a pro-market faction and then a public good faction, and that there would be a politics of maintaining balance between those that talented political leaders could do? And we might say the same thing is needed in the United States, that this is a problem of a kind of coalition that benefits from political machine versus a more open, competitive market system.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And this is one of the places where we Americans have to be very careful about lecturing China, because we had these kinds of politicians like Richard Lugar and the Republicans and Bill Bradley and the Democrats who focused on the country and maintained a kind of balance. And we've gotten rid of almost all those in the Congress. So we can't stand on a moral platform and criticize China. China is full of, and the Chinese government are full of pro-market reformers. And they're some of the most capable people in the world. The people at China's central bank, National Development Reform Commission, and Ministry of Finance, many of these people, we would be really proud if they were leading parts of the American government. The previous central bank governor, Governor Zhou, was extraordinary. And Xi Jinping has these people in his government. Liu He graduated of Harvard's Kennedy School. He is Xi Jinping's top economic advisor, and he understands the market. He's a very, very sensible, admirable economist and economic manager. So they have these people. On the political side, they also have a cadre of senior leaders who think first about the country and secondly about themselves or anything else. And so there always is a potential for balance, for overcoming mistakes. And that is also true on the political side. You know, when Hu Jintao was vice president of the country and president of the Central Party School, which trains top leaders, the Central Party School worked very hard on 3 scenarios for democratization. And so some of us thought that maybe when he became party secretary, we would see very fundamental political reform. And it didn't happen. But we still have senior academics and senior officials who come to Harvard and talk about the importance of rule of law, talk about the importance of some kind of democratization. So it's, if there's any single point I can leave you with, it's most important. It's just as it turns out, we have not reached the end of history in the Western world. China has not reached the end of history. And I think one of China's great strengths is that they know they haven't reached the end of history. I think even Xi Jinping would say 25 years from now, both the economy and the politics will be quite different. He and other people would probably disagree very fundamentally about different in what way, but they understand that things change and have to change, and that this is a developing system. Thank you very much for coming.